My name's Julia, I work at LSE Cities, and I trained as an architect, so sometimes feel like a bit of a fraud in this building, and not in this building, in those buildings. And I worked in practice before I started my PhD, and my PhD explored sort of shared infrastructures in the context of a peripheral, very working class community on the edge of Delhi. And during that period of time, I designed and built a sewage system, and that eventually got built. And just a shameless plug, you can also see a TEDx talk I did about that work in India. And why I mention that is that because I think what underpins all of my work is an intent, whether I do that or not is another question, but to work with people who are sort of forgotten or subordinated and alienated, and that's a kind of a continuous thread, whether that's women accessing toilets in India or young people and thinking about public space in the UK. And I think that's a kind of a commitment to something around maybe the sort of notion of co-production. And so in 2020, during the pandemic, I set up something called the apprenticeship scheme at LSE Cities. And for that project, we employed a group of young people, and it actually ended up being a two-year long project, which was a lot of it was online, but also in person. And these young people, they were hired and then they were trained, so we created a curriculum to apply sort of like methodologies and tools, learning from social sciences, and actually learning a lot from, I've stolen a lot from when I used to teach on the Cities by Design course here at LSE with, I'm assuming, some of you in this audience, but this time working with 16-year-olds instead. And this project was about understanding the potential of a future public space in Wembley Park, and it's actually what is now built, and you can see it here with the very imposing stadium in the background. And it was actually with this project and this methodology under my belt that in January of this year I, with Louise's help, applied for funding to further this methodology of working with young people. But in this case, not to produce a piece of architecture, but to actually think about producing a piece of research. And so the pitch that we put in was to further explore an innovative participatory research method, building off that apprenticeship scheme, and thereby furthering the method in which people with lived experience of the issues being studied take part in directing and conducting the research. And it's a method which recognizes that individuals within any community being researched are they themselves competent and very capable of participating even as researchers. So this project is actually primarily, and the funding that I got for was a methodological one, asking how peer participation is done in practice. And the question we were asking for this piece of work was, have girls been designed out of public spaces? And before we explore the images on the screen, it's worth saying that the UK has a democratic planning process, in that anyone can have a say on any piece of planning that's going through. This right is enshrined in the 2010 Equality Act. However, in practice, planning is full of jargon, it's difficult to access, and a lot of the methods by which public participation happens is really outdated in the form of sort of letter writing or town hall meetings. And the result is that right to participate in local planning is really difficult, and it's really difficult to sustain, particularly for young people, who are arguably the ones who are going to be most impacted by this change. So in a recent study, 89% of young people surveyed said they have never been asked about their neighbourhoods. And when they were asked if they would like to have a say, let's say on housing development, 97% said that they would like to. So this gap between an amazing willingness to participate and what's actually happening is kind of the source of this project and what we find so problematic. And when we're talking about public space, when young people are considered, there's sort of this gap that happens. So children are quite well provisioned for through playscapes, but teenagers, what tends to happen is this. This is the sort of tick box. And it's the famous Muga, the multi-use game area, or skate parks. And these are unfortunately almost entirely used by boys. And that's not to say that girls don't use them or can't use them. Girls skate, of course they do. I play football. But there's a sort of a problematic use of these spaces, and there is a whole body of work around that. And so we approach this project thinking that this exclusion, which is designed and it's paid for, they're quite expensive, these things can cost about £160,000, is problematic. And it's really important to say that this project is never and has never been about designing boys or men out. It's about designing women and young girls in. And so we were asking this question in 2 places, and this is Crewe, which was one of the study sites that we were looking at. It's a town in the northwest. It's just under about 80,000 people. And if you look at the sort of the provision, particularly in parks, you get 13 mugas, 16 play areas, 1 skate park, and 1 BMX track. And so this was a kind of like, what we can see in this mapping is this is a mapping of that sort of gender blind spot in public space provision. So from the limited literature and research in this field, there is, and as I said, we did a lit review as part of this project. It's really clear that teenage girls are really badly serviced by the public realm, and particularly public parks. A recent report in 2021 by Young Women in Glasgow Parks revealed that of the women and girls who use the parks, only 20% feel comfortable. As children get older, parks are used much more by boys than girls, and girls use them with less confidence. A Swedish study by an architecture firm called Whitekirk, I think, who are really great, they found that from the age of 8, the imbalance between boys and girls using spaces is 80-20, and that teenage girls feel 10 times more unsafe in public than boys do. And this lack of provision has a direct effect on their mental and physical health of young girls who feel unwanted and unsafe in public spaces. So from the age of 10, activity levels drop significantly in girls, and by the time teenage girls in the UK are 13 or 15, only 8% of them are engaging in the kind of activity that's recommended. And consequently, we've got 44% of girls who are sort of in that bracket of becoming overweight. And this is so problematic because by the time you're 16, someone's patterns tend to be set for life. So this has a kind of a lifetime impact on young girls and women. And the most horrific statistic, and we've been doing other work with young girls, and it's something that I kind of can't get my head around, is the level of sexual harassment towards extremely young girls and all the way up. So 2 out of 3 have been sexually harassed in public spaces, and I actually think it's higher than that from the work that I've been doing. And so at this point, I actually want to bring a we into the project, because this work was done with Olivia Feldman, who's worked on all of this with me. And Olivia came with more of a social science background and a keen knowledge and interest in queer and feminist literatures, and really helped shape this project. So thank you, Olivia. And for us, Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation was a useful framework. And emerging from a post-war context of citizen participation, this was kind of a critique of very sort of top-down technocratic blueprint approaches to planning that was very common at the time. And Arnstein's ladder categorized participation into these 8 hierarchical rungs, and that go from kind of at the bottom sort of manipulation and non-participation all the way up to citizen control. And for Arnstein, though, it's not just about power. So she writes, participation without redistribution of power is an empty and frustrating process for the powerless. So for us, participatory research isn't just the method, but it's actually a political project to give more control to the research participants, particularly those who are most excluded. So it's a political project to say, actually, I'm going to take a 16-year-old and bring him into the LSE and say that their experience is valid. And so children and young people, for example, have been objects of research for many years, but what have they gained? And so our approach was to think about this and attempt to redress this in the way that we can, which is what we came up with was this researcher in residence model. So the first researcher in residence program that we are aware of was established by the Department of Education in the 1990s, where university academics were placed in schools to engage with children in science. And so it was a model that was developed as a way to kind of democratize experience, moving that experience from the Marshall Building into where people live and work in their real lives. And it's really popular in social and health work, but I think empty in urban studies. And so our approach was we hired at the step band, which is the basic sort of LSE rate, step band 5, we hired 17 to 21 individuals who identified as girls and young women. They were selected between the 2 study sites, Crewe and Trowbridge, both areas that had been allocated quite significant funding, levelling up funding and high street town funding, which we thought was an interesting backdrop to be asking these questions. And in this diagram, I've put the researcher in residence at the side because in theory this model could work with anyone, young mums or the elderly, and it's also a bit maybe thinking about institutional design as the method. So our mixed method approach, which was mapping, digital, visual, provided a way in which we could connect with these young girls and women in an approachable, familiar, and sometimes even playful way to kind of expand on this methodology. So it was really, the method that we did for this project was sort of 4-pronged. So the first thing is we have an online curriculum. And that was on Miro, which is like an online whiteout board, which is a program I'm sort of obsessed with and would recommend you all use it. And then the second thing was we had weekly meetings on Zoom and also on Miro, so we could talk and draw and write together. And then we had research activities, which was built into the curriculum. So every week we asked them to conduct research, and the method by which we were asking them to do that was Instagram, which we set up an account. And then finally, sort of perhaps the most traditional thing was fieldwork using sociospatial mapping, which is again a common thread all the way back, thinking of my work in India. So if we start, I'm now going to go through these 4. So if we start looking at the curriculum, the hypothesis was that really, like, if you want to engage with young people particularly, I guess, and have conversations about have they been designed out of space, you can't just come in with that. You need to give them the language, the confidence, the tools, the skills, introduce them to that discourse. So the curriculum is perhaps, I would say, the most important thing that underpins our work. And we designed it such that each sort of session or module had a lecture and a reading, and the lecture was either something that we made especially for the course, or something that we found online that was suitable, and then a reading that we found. And we tried to kind of balance it so that the one of them was slightly more academic than the other one. I believe that it's it's really important to have. I have very high expectations of the young people I work with. I think the worst thing you can do is sort of dumb something down for someone, and so we never did that. And I'll show you in the next slide what I mean by that. And we also then, you've got the activity, discussion and feedback, and then sort of setting the task. And this was the curriculum. It was over 6 sessions, and you can see us kind of just starting from a definition, because I think for a lot of us as urbanists, like, we know what public space is, but do we? It's very complicated now because it's privatized, and there's a lot of, I'm not going to go into that. So, and you can see it at the end, we're dropping in and even thinking about, why design matters. So it's really thinking about the architecture. And this was what I meant. So for example, we were giving 16-year-olds the introductory text by Leslie Kern's amazing book. But in order to not have to sort of make someone feel bad, Olivia kindly produced like a cheat sheet so that it was sort of there, and you never had to raise your hand and be like, I don't understand this text. And I think there was also, because we were paying them at a salary at LSE, we had like a minimum hours and a maximum hours that they could do that was set because of the funding. And the minimum was what we felt was the minimum that was needed to deliver the project, and then the max was this funding constraint. And so it meant that we could litter our curriculum with, if you have extra time and you want to, really geek out on kind of these podcasts, go for it. And if not, here's the minimum expectation. And so this was what that curriculum looked like. And then we would come together once a week on Zoom for about an hour and a half, and on Miro. This is what Miro looks like, and you can see us there. And I don't know what I'm doing with that. And we would start to have conversations. In many ways, this would be what would typically in research be like structured interviews, sort of structured, semi-structured interviews. And this we were having on a weekly basis, building on each other. And so you can see here, this is week 2. And this is Crewe. We mirrored the same thing with Trowbridge. What is public space to you? And what do you value? So we would prompt, like in any sort of structured interview context, we would prompt the conversation with this component kind of pre-prepared in advance. And this was, for us, we really wanted to spatialize what we were talking about. So here we were asking them to think about elements, to think about the architecture, You know, there's a lot of literature on this subject matter in the social sciences, but very little in urban studies, and we really wanted to contribute to that. And then you can see here us sort of thinking about different typologies, you know, thinking about the difference between like retail spaces and green spaces. And yeah, then hitting it hard on, you know, have girls being designed out of public spaces. And this was the first session. Then we came back to that once they had looked at a series of case studies. Again, so the case studies is quite a typical method to further research. And here we again ask how, you know, how have girls been designed in through these case studies? And what was great about these conversations, well, at least I felt, was that we could talk about change that can happen tomorrow, like lighting, but also then what does that seed this sort of change that we really want to sort of, for example, for young people not to feel judged or for girls to not be harassed, which is like a really big social problem. But what can we do now that can almost seed this sort of much bigger change that also design can't do? You know, you can't design out sexual harassment. But, and so that was sort of some of the many fantastic conversations we were having. And then the activity, so as I mentioned, each week we would give them to effectively do research by themselves. So for example, what in your opinion makes this space a public space or not? So we would again prompt them with questions and arm them with their phones, which everyone has. And I mean, this is when I felt like a total dinosaur because I've never done a reel in my life, and we actually had to get Olivia's younger sister to show us how this is done. But what was amazing for us to witness was how, you know, none of these girls, well actually two of them from Trowbridge were aspiring architects, which happened by accident. Most of them had no interest in any of the design professions, but Instagram was this incredibly intuitive way to go out and be visual with your analysis, to look at a space, and you can do these sort of, I couldn't quite capture the photograph, but this is a sort of an animated something in Instagram. I still don't know what I'm doing on that platform. And it's, you know, you could highlight things. It was such an easy way to connect a thought or a feeling to a photograph. And so we thought this was an incredibly successful way to drive the conversation. And sort of fieldwork. So this was perhaps what we imagined as our most kind of substantive contribution. And so we prepped them with a lecture on mapping techniques, introducing them to space syntax and, you know, all of the big names. But actually on the ground, when you map, this was a map that was produced in our first session where we gave them really simple prompts. So what do you use, what do you not use, and what do you not use that you would like to use? And very quickly, we can get a really nice analysis of the town center of Crewe, where you can see here that the spaces in yellow, these are betting shops and male barbers that they felt were really male spaces that were really dominating the high street. And in pink, this was sort of this loss, and this was when they started articulating, which I've actually never heard in the high street literature, is how young girls feel that the loss of affordable retail has really sort of ruptured something that they used to do. And they would talk about when they was, you know, I used to go to Next, New Look, I can't anymore, and so on. And part of it too is Crewe's undergoing a huge redevelopment, which has taken a huge chunk of the city out, and they feel that really acutely. And so this mapping was a really quick way to tease that out and actually do quite sophisticated assessments. Then in between that mapping and our last mapping, we had asked them on Instagram to set out a series of principles. This was at the end of the project, set a series of principles for public space. And some of these were incredibly amazing. So we do not accept that women and girls are responsible to change who they are and what they do in order to protect themselves. Yes, we do not. And then what we then did was we said, right, okay, you've come up with these quite big principles. So something like that. We collated them together, sort of up there you can see my dodgy writing. So like the right to be considered. We reject tokenism. And young people know when they're being used. And then we had a conversation when we used this case study of this park, and we visited it with a member of the local authority. This park has a muga and a play area and a huge green space, and that's it. And all the lighting is shining onto the muga and nowhere else. So we then said, take those principles and what can be translated into something physical? And so for example, like the principle to prioritize women, that resulted in like predictably lighting. That's an easy one. But so something like one of the principle of care, so we want care for everyone was one of their principles. That resulted in having a piece of road wide enough for a woman and a buggy. and less predictable. And this is an overview of all of the work. So you can see here the curriculum in the middle, the conversations with Crewe, the conversations with Trowbridge, and then finally these recordings if anyone couldn't show up. So what did we learn? I think we learned a lot. One of our key findings, though, was this idea that emerged was that actually feelings of judgment are spatialized. And judgment is typically conceived of as interpersonal and social, when in fact we found that it's also spatial. So we heard how a swing that is too narrow to fit a young woman's hips does impart judgment on that person. And so we are right now writing a piece about these layers of judgment that we found through our research, which starts from like a bench, like the object, through to a place like the playground, the bench where this is not for you, like they know that it's not for them. This is meant for sort of elderly couples to sit, to the playground where they're tutted at if they're hanging out by other mums, all the way up to the high street where they're actually harassed. And given looks. So for example, here are some quotes. Just look at the time before I hover on those. On high streets, there's a lot of stigma about people our age loitering. I tend to avoid them because I don't want to be frowned upon. And on Mugas, yes, there's nothing stopping us going through the gates, but we don't feel we should. And on swings, if there are lads there, it's like your worst nightmare come true, so you don't want to go back. It also isn't suitable for stereotypical girl clothing, like uniforms with a skirt, not practical. With a skirt on, you don't want to flash teenage boys or men. So our methodology, we feel, opened up a space for young girls to be consistently reflecting on their experiences, especially for those who were slightly older and had already internalized and normalized a lot of their experiences. And actually, this is something that Olivia and I reflected on, that we too had internalized and normalized a lot of this stuff. And so maybe we weren't suitable to actually do the research using traditional methods. And this, and it also allowed them to reflect on spaces that were very common to them, almost banal, to go and revisit them. And that allowed them to test some of their own assumptions that they might have had early on. And then we also heard how being paid and being hired effectively as our colleagues gave them a feeling of being validated, and that validation of their experiences meant that that was meaningful, and so that meant that they could table them. We also found that mapping, which we actually felt was this substantive piece of analysis, what was first and foremost more important was that it allowed for this kind of trust building exercise. We had lunch together, made these maps together. Young girls won't just open up and talk about how they're vulnerable, or even how they're very excited in public space and things that turn them on. They're not going to do that. So this method, we felt, opened up the time and the space and the commitment to have these tricky, sometimes very tricky conversations. And finally, we felt that Instagram was a really fantastic medium for young people because it was easy to use, flexible, and intuitive, and very familiar. So finally, what we're doing now, next steps, we're trying to work in different geographies. So for example, in Crewe, the buses are intermittent, they're empty, they're very scary. In London, the back and the top of the bus, everyone knows. That's for teenagers, so it's very different contexts. We're trying to find, we want to work with, we're actually doing work with different groups now, sort of mixed groups, or and would like to work with boys only. We're expanding the curriculum and beyond public space and thinking about housing. I think it'd be really important to ask similar questions to boys about alleyways and how they feel judged. And we also feel that there's a need for a more long-term engagement, because this project, actually because of its funding, was restricted to sort of a 4-month process. And we also want to work more closely with local authorities because, for example, one of the things that we've seen across all of our work is this idea of young people, they want to be seen but not seen. That's in itself a contradiction. So how do you deal with sort of planners who don't like contradictions? They want certainties and facts. And so that, for us, is something that we really want to explore going forward. So thank you very much for your time. I hope I haven't overspoken. And just to reiterate, Mike did this incredible film for us, and you can see the girls from Crewe talking. And if you haven't seen it, please do. Thanks very much.